Carl Jung spent decades studying people who never quite fit. Not people who failed, not people who gave up. People who, by every external measure available to the world, appeared to be running behind. Running late, running out of time. And what he found, buried beneath years of clinical data and psychological observation, was something that completely inverted the way most of us think about timing, success, and what it actually means to be built for something significant. The people he was most fascinated by were not the ones who arrived early. They were the ones who arrived differently, who spent their 20s in what looked like confusion, their 30s in what looked like stagnation, and then at some point, without dramatic announcement, began producing something that the fast arrivals had never managed to reach. Not because they finally caught up, because they had been building something the entire time that simply could not be rushed. This is about 7 signs that you carry that personality. And what Jung believed was really happening inside the people the world spent years misreading as lost. If something in that already shifted inside you, subscribe and leave a like. And at the end, drop a comment with the number of the sign that has felt most like your own life. Read what other people write, because the person who responds to your comment has been walking the same road. The first sign is that childhood never felt like full participation. It felt like observation from just outside the frame. Most children absorb their environment almost automatically. They watch, they imitate, they step into the world the adults around them are modeling and begin to inhabit it. The child carrying this personality does something different. They watch too. But there is a distance built into their watching that has nothing to do with shyness and nothing to do with fear. It is more like they are observing a system they are not yet convinced they understand, and they will not pretend to understand it until they do. You may recognize this. The child at the edge of the playground who was not afraid of the others, but was genuinely occupied with something the others seemed not to notice. The student who looked out the window not because the lesson was boring, but because the mind had already moved past it. What the teachers called distraction was actually a form of depth that the environment was not designed to accommodate. Jung described it as a psyche in which the unconscious is unusually active, where meaning and emotion converge before language is ready to carry them. The result is a child who feels things at a register that has no outlet, who senses significance in places no one else is looking, and who carries the quiet exhaustion of a frequency the world around them was never tuned to receive. The second sign is that the questions you asked as a child were the ones adults deflected instead of answered. There is a specific and very particular kind of loneliness that comes from asking a genuine question and watching the adult in front of you search for an answer they do not have, and then offer something that neither of you finds convincing. If this personality is in you, you probably experienced this before you were 12. Why do people believe things that hurt them? What actually holds a person together when no one is watching? If everyone is pretending to understand something, does understanding it even exist? These are not the questions of a difficult child. They are the questions of a mind that cannot accept the surface of something when it senses that there is depth beneath it. Jung called this the burden of consciousness. The uncomfortable and largely involuntary capacity to see through the structures other people need intact in order to function without anxiety. And here is the part that is rarely discussed. When you ask the questions that reveal the cracks in what everyone has agreed to believe, you do not receive answers. You receive the quiet but unmistakable message that your curiosity is excessive, that your need for coherence is inappropriate, that you should simply accept what everyone else seems to have accepted without effort. But you could not. And that inability was not a defect. It was the earliest available sign that your mind was going to construct meaning from the ground up, not inherit it pre-assembled. That process is slower. It has always been slower. But what you build from the ground up does not collapse when the world questions it, because you questioned it first from every angle you could reach. Share this with someone who has been told their whole life that they think too much. Because what this next sign reveals is that the thinking was never the problem. The third sign is that decisions other people made with apparent ease felt to you like calculations that had no clean resolution. There is a moment in early adult life when the people around you seem to choose with a certainty that looks almost supernatural. They pick careers, they commit to identities, they declare the kind of person they are and the kind of life they want, and they begin moving toward it with a confidence that seems to require no unusual courage. And you stood in front of the same options and could not move. Not because you were incapable. Not because ambition was missing, but because you could see too much. Every path you considered, you could also see its cost. Every identity you tried on, you could feel the parts of yourself it would leave behind. Every yes you approached was already carrying 20 invisible no's that the people around you seemed entirely unable to perceive. Jung believed this paralysis was not indecision. It was integrity operating before you had developed the vocabulary to name it. Your psyche was refusing to commit to anything that would require abandoning something essential. So you hesitated. You tried things and let them go. You watched others move down roads you had considered and set aside. And somewhere underneath all of it, a quiet and persistent fear grew. What if there is no place for me? What if I am simply not built to fit anywhere? That fear was not telling you the truth. You were never failing to choose. You were refusing to choose falsely. And those are not the same thing, even when they look identical from the outside. The fourth sign is that your 20s looked from almost every external angle like subtraction rather than construction. The people around you were adding credentials, adding relationships, adding the visible markers that the world uses to confirm that a person is becoming someone. And you were doing something that had no equivalent metric. You were shedding beliefs you had inherited but never examined. Walking away from paths that looked correct on paper but felt hollow when you actually stood on them. Losing interest in the approval of people whose values you had never genuinely agreed with in the first place. Jung called this individuation. The long, largely invisible, unglamorous work of separating who you actually are from everything the world decided you should be before you had any say in the matter. And he believed it was the most psychologically demanding process a human being could undertake. The reason it looks like stagnation from the outside is because subtraction cannot be photographed. You cannot point to what you removed and receive recognition for the removal. No one celebrates the beliefs you stopped performing. No one marks the moment you refused to become a version of yourself that would have been easier to explain at a dinner table. But Jung understood something about this that almost no one else articulated. The people who skip this stage, who simply absorb the identity offered to them and move forward without questioning it, they arrive early, but they arrive at something that fits the shape of a life without fitting the substance of it. And a life that does not fit, genuinely fit, eventually fractures. You paid a price for the individuation. You paid it in confusion, in solitude, in the particular grief of watching others accumulate what you could not yet claim. But you paid it once. Because what you are building now has foundations that are actually yours. The fifth sign is that you have always been able to see endings before the evidence for them existed. This is one of the signs that is hardest to explain to someone who does not share it. There is a kind of knowing that arrives fully formed, without logical sequence, without the data points that rational explanation requires. An intuition about people, about situations, about which directions lead somewhere real, and which lead to something that resembles life from the outside but is hollow when you arrive. You have probably learned to keep this quiet. Because when you try to explain that, you simply knew. That you could feel the outcome of something years before the evidence was visible. People want the process. They want the reasoning. They want you to reverse engineer something that did not go through the part of the mind that produces explanations. Jung described this as the intuitive function operating at a dominant level. The capacity to perceive patterns, implications, and trajectories that conscious reasoning has not yet caught up to. And in this personality type, that function is so active that ordinary decision-making can feel almost impossible. How do you commit to a path when you can already feel which ones lead somewhere you do not want to be? How do you participate in a game when you can see the ending, and the ending is not something you are willing to accept? You wait. You hold the standard of your own perception, and you wait for something that passes it. And while you wait, the world tells you that you are being too slow, too selective, too resistant to simply choosing something and committing. But you were not being resistant. You were being accurate. And the people who dismiss that accuracy are often the ones who, years later, are living inside the consequences of decisions your intuition had already mapped. The sixth sign is that solitude has never felt like absence to you. It has always felt like access. For most people, being alone is the state between connections, the gap that gets filled. For this personality type, solitude is not the absence of something. It is the presence of something that crowded environments make impossible to reach. Your inner world has architecture. It has rooms and depths that most people never construct because they never spend enough uninterrupted time alone to build them. You may have been told that this is a problem, that your comfort with solitude signals avoidance, or an inability to connect, or some form of social reluctance that should be corrected. But you have known at some level that this framing is inverted. You are not retreating from connection. You are protecting something that shallow connection genuinely threatens. Jung believed this was not a symptom in people who carry this personality. It was a developmental necessity. The kind of psyche that operates at this depth requires extended periods of internal dialogue to integrate what it has experienced, to process what it has perceived, to achieve a coherence that cannot be borrowed from other people's frameworks. Without solitude, this personality fragments. It becomes reactive. It responds to every external pressure and loses the internal compass that is its only reliable source of direction. If solitude has always been where you recover your sense of who you are not broken. You are doing exactly what this kind of mind must do in order to become whole. The seventh sign is the one that means something has already changed. It is the sign that the shift has begun, even if you have not named it yet. There comes a point, often without announcement, often so quietly that you only recognize it when you look back, when you stop explaining yourself to people who were never going to understand the explanation. You stop justifying why you are not where the timeline said you should be. You stop translating your internal pace into a language designed for people moving at a different speed. This is not defensiveness, it is not resignation. It is something quieter and far more durable than either of those things. It is the first real evidence of coherence. The moment when your inner world and your outer life begin, for the first time, to move in the same direction. You are not fighting the timeline anymore. You are not pretending to be outside it while quietly measuring yourself against it. You have accepted in a way that has actual weight rather than just intellectual agreement, that the timeline was never designed for a mind like yours. And what happens after that acceptance is something most people who have only moved at speed cannot recognize when they see it. You begin to move more precisely. Decisions carry weight because they are made from alignment rather than from anxiety. Your words land differently because they are not padded with apology. Your presence changes something in rooms not because you are performing, but because you have stopped needing to. Jung believed this was the moment the rare personality finally enters life, not as someone still searching for where they fit, but as someone who has stopped requiring the fit to be confirmed by anything outside themselves. A childhood that felt like watching from just outside the frame. Questions that the adults around you could not answer. Decisions that refused to resolve themselves cleanly. A decade of subtraction that looked from every external angle like stagnation. An intuition that mapped endings before the evidence arrived. A solitude that was never emptiness, even when other people called it that. And finally, a quiet arrival that no one marked with applause because it did not require applause to be real. If these signs have followed you through your life, Jung's research points to something specific. You were not behind. You were on a path that does not share a measurement system with the one the world uses to evaluate progress. The years that looked like wandering were not wasted. The confusion was not evidence of a defect. The delay was the necessary condition of a self that could not be handed to you. It could only be drawn out of you, slowly, across years that looked from the outside like nothing was happening. The doubt you carried about your own timeline was never evidence that something was wrong with you. It was evidence that you were being measured against a standard that was never built to hold someone built the way you are. Drop a comment with the number of the sign that has described your life most accurately, and read what other people write, because the person who responds to your comment has been carrying the same experience in silence. Subscribe to this channel if this is the kind of conversation you have been looking for. Share this with someone who has spent years believing they were simply late, because the difference between late and differently timed is the difference between a life spent apologizing and a life spent building what only you were capable of building.